All right, you guys, I'm so excited for this episode. We have for you guys Dr. Bryan Saunders. He is a researcher and expert in all things caffeine. And I'm sure many of our listeners utilize caffeine. I know I utilize caffeine. So there's a lot of, I think, probably myths out there regarding caffeine. And hopefully we'll get to the bottom of a lot of those today. But we're also going to dive into some of Bryan's research and go over that. And then we're going to answer a lot of your guys' listener questions, which I thought were excellent questions that you guys shared with us. So we will get to those as well. So thank you, Bryan, so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invite. It's always a pleasure.
Yes. And he's zooming in from Brazil. So thank you and thankful for technology. So this is we're excited to have you here. So our listeners know about this, but we'll dive straight into your two truths and a lie to get the ball rolling here and get our listeners kind of thinking throughout the episode. So go ahead and break those down for us, Bryan.
Okay. I'm out here in Brazil, but I think most will probably can maybe see and think that I'm not your typical looking Brazilian. So I'm actually British.
Mm-hmm.
But my first truth or lie is I'm British, but I've lived more of my life in Brazil than I've actually lived in Britain.
Okay.
Number two, I don't know if you can see, so I've got a cycling top on. I'm a keen cyclist and I own a total of 8 different bikes.
Okay.
And number three, one of my primary research focuses and what we'll discuss today is caffeine and exercise performance. But I don't actually ingest caffeine specifically myself. So I don't drink coffee, I don't drink energy drinks or tea or anything like that.
Oh my goodness. This is good. Okay. That would be really fascinating. But I could see that. I could see that.
Same.
I also could see the cyclist with 8 different bikes. I kind of feel like the first one is a lie. What do you think?
I am gonna go with, oh yeah, I feel like it could be the first two because maybe you lived somewhere else besides Brazil. But I'm gonna go with maybe you have like 10 bikes.
Oh, wow.
I'll go with the bikes being the liar, maybe 7.
Okay. All right. Well, we will reveal it for our listeners at the end of the episode. I'm very curious to figure out if this caffeine, you drinking caffeine or not, is true. So we will see. I'm excited to learn about that. So why don't you take us back a little ways, Bryan, and let us know what got you excited about just research in general, and then specifically going into caffeine and performance research.
Sure. I think at the start, at least, I had one of those traditional entries into university. Sort of our school directed us towards university. Although I think when you're sort of 16, 17, 18, you don't really have a clue of what you want to study.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought I liked sports and I liked mathematics. So I did an undergraduate in sports science and mathematics at Nottingham-Trent University in the UK. And after that, I decided to focus more on the sports side. So I did a master's at Loughborough. But then after that, I was in one of those sort of usual, I don't really know what I'm meant to be doing with my life. And you know, positions weren't sort of easy to get. I always tell people there was a moment at which I applied for a position that kind of advertised itself as work experience. And they told me I didn't have enough work experience.
Oh,
And
no.
so when you don't have enough work experience to get work experience, I thought I'm completely at a loss here. So I got in contact with my dissertation supervisor from my undergraduate. And, you know, she said that she thought I worked quite well and invited me the opportunity to properly get into research and do a PhD with her and one of her colleagues. And so that's what I did. I went back to Nottingham-Trent University and I started researching in the area of beta-alanine supplementation. And so I guess that was kind of my gateway supplement into all the other supplements around, because since then, you know, later on I moved to Brazil and I've continued to research on beta-alanine supplementation, its sort of effects on the muscle, on exercise performance, but then also other supplements, so sodium bicarbonate. nitrate, creatine, and obviously caffeine supplementation as well. So that's kind of the long way
Cool.
into how I got here. Yeah.
Yes. So covering all those legal ergogenic supplements in sport right now.
Yes, the legal
Very
ones.
cool.
Yeah.
What with the beta alanine initial PhD research, what was that looking into specifically with the beta alanine?
So at the time, beta alanine was still quite new. I mean, I guess it's kind of 20 years old in terms of what we really know about its effects on exercise performance, but we didn't really know much about its effects on performance. So we specifically looked at kind of short duration, high intensity, and also repeated high intensity exercise bouts. Also focusing kind of on a team sport setting, on whether or not it can help performance during that kind of activity. So
cool. And when you say team sport, are we talking like field sports like soccer and stuff like that? Okay.
exactly. Soccer, hockey, rugby, but kind of you can kind of generalize. We use kind of generalized tests where you're looking at general kind of repeated sprintability and high intensity performance throughout simulated tests. Yeah.
Very cool. Okay. And we had kind of done some digging. You had been involved in a systematic review and meta-analysis on caffeine and the CYP1A2 gene and
Yes.
performance. So I want to dive into kind of what you came to your conclusion through that, but can you explain to our listeners what the CYP1A2 gene is and what it does and why we would want to look at that and caffeine together?
Yes, of course. So essentially, if we just go back and think about what caffeine is essentially a drug. As you mentioned, it's a legal drug that we can find in plants, and that's now accepted as a kind of ergogenic aid. But obviously, when we ingest it, the body then has to process it, and that's primarily processed by the P450 enzyme in our liver. Okay, so about 95% of caffeine is metabolized in the liver by this specific enzyme. And so we have genes in our bodies that determine how quickly this enzyme metabolizes caffeine. And so the differences in these genes we call single nucleotide polymorphisms. So it's just a single change in a DNA building block that means that people will either metabolize caffeine faster or slower. So essentially, because of these differences between people, and because of the way, say, we inherit genes from our parents, we'll get one from our mother and one from our father. And so these are either for this specific polymorphism, either A genes or C genes or C nucleotides. So if a person has two AAs, so that means that they're homozygote AA, and they are fast metabolizers of caffeine. If somebody has two CCs, they're homozygotes, but they're very slow metabolizers of caffeine. And so if you have one of each, an A and a C, that's kind of what we call the intermediate, but it's probably, based upon what I think we know, it's still towards the lower end of the scale of speed of metabolism, but we still call it kind of the intermediate metabolism of caffeine. So the theory is that obviously the quicker you metabolize or get rid or create new other products after you process this caffeine, this could influence how well caffeine influences exercise performance. So that's something that's an area that people have really garnered interest in over the last 10 years, and research has really started to take off over the last 10 years in this area for sure.
That's very interesting. So with the fast caffeine metabolizers versus our slow homozygous caffeine metabolizers, when we talk about fast and slow, is the caffeine taking longer to be felt, or is it staying in the system overall longer, or both?
So I guess with the fast metabolizers, it's being converted quicker. So
Okay.
essentially it's taking that caffeine and it firstly processes them into its three primary subsequent metabolites, which are paraxanthine, theophylline, and theobromine. So those with a slow metabolism will have caffeine in their system for longer than those with a faster metabolism.
Okay.
But what that specifically means in terms of, you know, what that happens to the body, what happens to exercise performance is still kind of up for debate. And I guess we can get into that now if you like.
Yeah, certainly. One final question on the fast and slow stuff. What are you seeing? And I'm sure there's a range, but when we talk about fast metabolizers, and I'm sure there's other genes involved as well, but how fast is that caffeine getting into the system and they're starting to feel it versus the slow caffeine metabolizers?
Good question. And I think, I hope I'm not wrong on this. I think that there's not actually any specific data yet to show how quickly individuals will process it, how different people's sensations are, side effects, feelings of that are. So how different they are between different genotypes. So I can get a quick and plug in about one of my PhD students' projects, which is exactly that. So we've done a kind of 24-hour time course looking at caffeine supplementation. So in a capsule, taking kind of a recommended dose. And we've measured blood at numerous time points over a 24-hour period. We've also measured commonly felt side effects like, you know, motivation, agitation, things like that, drowsiness, sleepiness, all these kinds of things. And we're in the final stages, but obviously the most important stage, which is finding out, you know, what do these caffeine values look like in the blood at the minute. So unfortunately, I don't have these data right now, but hopefully in the next few months we'll be able to tell you exactly that. But if you look at the, you know, the data in general, you know, people do seem to vary so much. I mean, following, you know, a recommended dose of maybe 200 milligrams or approximately 200 milligrams, you'll probably peak caffeine in the blood around 1 hour after supplementation. But then again, the time to then get rid of that will vary hugely between people. The general kind of half-life that people mention is about 5 to 6 hours. So it'll take 5 to 6 hours for half of that to be processed. But you know, you can see individuals who'll still have caffeine in their system 24 to 30 hours after ingesting caffeine. So it really can take a long time. But whether or not that still has like a large effect is probably doubtful. You're probably, you know, just in the last little phases there.
It's interesting to think about it like that too. And people who are having like a morning cup of coffee and then maybe like a noon, mid-afternoon cup of coffee, they might have caffeine in their system 24 hours a day, day after day after day, potentially. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll let you give us kind of a breakdown of the meta-analysis paper and kind of what you guys were looking for and gathering and what you kind of discovered from that.
Okay. So again, I think if we just take that one little step back and think about the caffeine literature and what we know, I think caffeine's hugely studied. There's lots of studies out there. Off the top of my head, maybe over 200, maybe even over 300, if not more. And it's been shown to be pretty effective for a wide range of different exercise types. You know, you look at it like sprint-based activity, maybe a more short duration anaerobic-based activity, endurance exercise, strength-based, team sports, combat sports. If you think about a sport and whether or not caffeine improves it, there's probably some study confirming a certain efficacy within it. I'd say it's the literature, in my opinion, is that strong.
Wow.
But despite this kind of overall mean effect, when you look individually within studies, not all individuals show a positive response to caffeine. And obviously the ideal way to like truly measure if somebody's, say, a responder or a non-responder is to measure them on numerous occasions. The majority of studies don't do that. But still, there seems to be some variability in the response. And so this potential genetic variation in caffeine metabolism has been suggested to be a contributing factor. So I'd say the first study maybe came out about 12 years ago. Is maybe I think a group out of Australia with Womack as the first author. But so we've been studying it for about 12 years now, whether or not there is an influence of genotype on CYP1A2 genotype on exercise performance following caffeine supplementation. And so that first study did show that the fast metabolizers had a performance benefit. And although the slow metabolizers also showed a performance benefit, it was much smaller than those with a fast metabolism. So, you know, when the first study in that area kind of shows a potentially interesting effect, then it's like, oh, everybody's like running out to try to test it themselves, obviously. But, you know, science isn't perfect. There's lots of different methodologies that people have used, different doses, different participant groups, different exercise types. And so when you then look at what the literature looks like, it's, this study shows an effect, this one doesn't, this one shows the inverted effect of that previous one. So then you've got to start thinking, well, number one, what's the actual state of the literature right now? Like, let's have an evaluation of this. And then also, how confident can we be in the studies that have been performed to date? You know, how robust are they in their methodology? So those were the kind of the two things that we'd, as a group, had been thinking over the last few years, because, you know, we had our own study ongoing, but, you know, COVID came along and things got a bit slow, and we were dying to sort of think about what the state of the literature was. So we decided to then investigate. So we put together a team of really good students who performed the main bulk of the work of this meta-analysis or systematic review and meta-analysis, because, you know, it's in the name. Systematic review means you have to do everything systematically. So we have to search the literature really robustly to make sure we find everything that's in there regarding caffeine supplementation on exercise performance, with genotyping of the different individuals. So that's like the one important factor. And it's a lot of work. So the students had to, you know, filter about 1,500 studies to check, you know, have these studies got all the inclusion criteria that we want. And I think by the end of it, we came to about 16 studies which had measured the effects of caffeine on exercise performance, and they'd separated participants based upon which genotype they specifically had.
Cool. That's great.
So then, okay, so obviously long-winded, going around the long way, but okay, so what did we mainly find? What were our overall results? So I guess the main result is we found that, so when you look at the effect of caffeine supplementation in the fast metabolizers, those AA individuals, seems to be good. There was a small benefit on exercise performance. So based upon the way we kind of calculate an effect size, and we can say whether it's a very small, a moderate, or a large effect. And it's a small overall effect on exercise performance. But again, that's maybe what you would expect with a supplement. You're never gonna double your performance just because you've taken some caffeine, obviously. For the ACs, so those heterozygotes who are the intermediate metabolizers, they seem to still have a benefit also, which maybe wasn't thought in the literature. But it was smaller than the effect in AA homozygotes. So a very small, we would say, performance benefit. But again, this can be meaningful in a competitive setting. You see those kind of bike races where, everybody's cycled 250 kilometers, but everybody finishes with the same time because it's that sprint finish. So it really can mean a lot in a competitive setting, in my opinion. And then the really interesting part was that those CC slow metabolizers actually, not only did they not show a performance benefit, they actually showed a small worsening in exercise performance with caffeine supplementation. So that was something that we were maybe a little surprised with, but also based upon a few studies that had come out, it did sort of suggest that these individuals might not benefit and might actually perform worse because of caffeine.
That's so interesting.
I'd say those are kind of the main results. If I may, I would like to put a few caveats to that, because
please.
Because, well, number one, we also looked at, well, how does maybe timing of supplementation, because again, not all studies time supplementation prior to exercise the same. How does dose modify these performance enhancing effects, or at least performance enhancing for the AAs and the ACs? And actually, for those two groups who improved performance, there didn't seem to be an effect. So irrespective of timing, irrespective of dose, caffeine seems to work for these individuals. But then for those slow metabolizers, there was an influence of dose and timing. And so what does this mean? It seemed like that these individuals can get a performance benefit from supplementation, but maybe what they have to do is they have to take caffeine further out from exercise. So they'll get their benefits later, suggesting that maybe having caffeine in the system actually isn't what you want. Maybe it's actually processing it and having it metabolized. And then it's those subsequent metabolites which might have a more important effect. Just a bit of a hypothesis. Could be more important. And maybe a slightly higher dose for these individuals as well. So rather than, the kind of general recommendations are maybe 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of body mass. So for somebody who's 70 kilos, that would be about 210 milligrams. But maybe going the higher end of that might be more beneficial for these slow metabolizers. So it doesn't mean it wouldn't work, but definitely some caution is needed with these slow metabolizers. I think then the other main point of caution that I would highlight regarding our analysis. So within our study, we assessed the impact of potential bias and reported conflict of interest. So we called it as reported conflicts of interest because I don't think say, and what does this mean? So when a study reports that this study was funded by a company that sells caffeine, or a company that provides genetic testing, this kind of thing, is this necessarily a conflict of interest? No. Most of my work also has these reported conflicts of interest because we get supplements free of charge, or we manage to secure funding because otherwise we can't pay for certain analyses. But it's still interesting to look at, well, is there a difference between studies that have this potential conflict of interest and studies that don't? And so when we separated those studies, all of a sudden in the studies without a conflict of interest, there's no longer an influence of genotype on exercise performance.
Interesting.
So it seems to be all those studies with a reported conflict of interest that are kind of pushing the data towards the CC individuals having a worsened performance. Again, I don't want to sit here and say, oh, they've manipulated data. It truly is. Because actually, as it happens, those studies who reported a conflict of interest, in terms of their actual study quality, as assessed by our kind of tools, they also scored very poorly. So, for example, some studies might not have performed a familiarization to an exercise protocol. So if you have somebody come into the lab and perform a time trial, most people have never performed a time trial in a lab setting. So from day 1 to day 2, you're going to get better simply because you've learned how to pace the protocol better. And so some of these studies who have reported large worsening of performance with caffeine in those slow metabolizers, they were the ones who maybe didn't familiarize their participants adequately to the protocols. So that could explain this effect. So I'd say overall, it seems like there might be something going on for CC for slow metabolizers, but maybe some caution is still needed. It doesn't mean it's definitely happening. And maybe some more research is needed. And that's something that we're trying to do and some other groups are also doing, I know.
Yeah, that is very interesting. You mentioned dosing too throughout. So was it the dosing amount, was it pretty consistent throughout the studies, or what kind of ranges were you seeing?
Yeah, as far as I can remember, for the most part, so the recommendations that we have out there are generally to take between 3 and 6 milligrams per kilogram of body mass of caffeine. So the majority of studies have shown that that's a pretty effective dose. And from what I can remember within our study here as well, the vast majority of dosing protocols did use these specific protocols. But even then, there are studies showing that even as low as 1 milligram per kilogram can improve performance. It might be potentially less likely or potentially a smaller effect. But again, if somebody doesn't want to take too much caffeine, that it's potentially a place to go and still get a benefit. And even above 6 milligrams, there is data out there suggesting that as high as 9 or even 12 milligrams per kilo, which is a lot of caffeine. It's a lot of caffeine. But even that can also benefit performance. But then again, at the higher end, you're maybe looking at maybe more side effects that people don't want. So that's why, the recommendations are generally 3 to 6. Choose somewhere in and around there that you're happy with, and then adapt.
And with that dose, the 3 to 6 milligram per kilo range, is this a one-time dose pre-exercise or race starting, or are they doing this like per hour during a long race?
I definitely wouldn't recommend, especially the 6 milligrams per to do that per hour. So no, usually, so the vast majority of studies, will have performed an exercise task, whether it be lasting 1 minute to 2 to 3 hours, and they will usually have provided caffeine about an hour pre-exercise.
Gotcha.
So,
Okay.
so that's what they will normally have done. Now, obviously, as you've mentioned, you have a lot of listeners who are endurance cyclists, and maybe even those ultra endurance cyclists. It's a little bit difficult then to extrapolate completely to their tasks. If you're going to be running for 8, 9, 10 or more hours, is that dose all the way back there still going to have an effect? I would say potentially, again, because the washout of caffeine is quite slow, but a potential way to get around that is think, okay, let's go for a maximum of 6 milligrams per kilo on the day or throughout the event. And then you could say microdose it over. So maybe if you want it, to get going, to get your adrenaline flowing at the start already, let's take 2 milligrams per kilo, 1 hour pre or 45 minutes pre. And then at a certain phases throughout, kind of you're topping up maybe 1 milligram per kilo every 1 to 2 hours, something like that. I think that could could be a nice way to go.
Mhm.
But there's no specific studies with looking at caffeine over hugely long exercise durations, as far as I'm aware.
Mhm. And kind of touching back to a little bit on why is caffeine working to help us improve performance? Can you break down a little bit of that, like physiology of how it's working?
Sure, of course. So essentially, the chemical structure of caffeine is very similar to something called adenosine. So that means that it can bind to the adenosine receptors that we have in the body. And we have these receptors all over the body. But of most interest, we believe, relating to exercise performance, are the adenosine receptors that are found in the central nervous system. Okay. So essentially, adenosine receptors bind throughout the day to these receptors, and they have a huge role in, say, the sleep-wake cycle. We know that increased binding throughout the day will increase our sleepiness, our drowsiness, and essentially resulting in our need to sleep at some point. Caffeine can bind to these adenosine receptors, so they're an antagonist. So that means that adenosine can't go in and do its job, and so you're inhibiting the effects essentially of adenosine. And so adenosine has quite a depressive effect on the central nervous system. So when adenosine, say, is bound to these receptors, there's a reduction in maybe motivation, in behavioral activation, volition. So when you're not allowing adenosine to do this, you kind of get the opposite. You're increasing motivation and increasing behavioral activation, which can obviously lead to maybe more effort during exercise. Adrenaline as well has a depressive effect on the release of adrenaline, noradrenaline, which most people associate with kind of that fight or flight trait, that evolutionary trait of, it kind of stimulates hyperarousal. So if you're able to increase adrenaline, noradrenaline, you're also increasing cardiac output, blood flow, circulating glucose. So all of this can benefit the working muscles during exercise. And we also know that there's adenosine receptors in nerve endings that are involved in kind of the transduction of pain signals.
Oh.
So essentially, when we antagonize these receptors, we can reduce the pain associated with exercise. So if you think about it, that's why we see in a lot of studies there's a reduced perception of pain and especially perception of effort. So essentially, for the same amount of effort, you could potentially be chugging out more work. So that's in general. There's a few potential direct mechanisms on the muscle.
So you were talking about the nerve endings and muscle. You were talking about something about muscle contraction too, I think, where we left off.
Okay, yeah. So we also believe, or it has been shown that caffeine can have a direct effect on calcium release in the muscle. So essentially, calcium is needed for and highly important for muscle contraction. So if you can increase the kind of sensitivity of the muscle to this, you can improve muscle contraction. It's a bit debatable whether or not at the doses we provide people this actually happens, but there's a lot of potential mechanisms there through which caffeine can improve exercise performance, and probably why it can improve so many different types of performance, that it's not just, say, one type of high intensity, short duration exercise. It seems across the board to be pretty effective.
Yeah, that's interesting. So from a performance lens, we talked about potential dosing. Would you encourage an athlete to get their genetics tested to determine their metabolism rate of caffeine? Or is that something that people can roughly gauge based off of when they, quote unquote, feel the caffeine kick in?
Unfortunately, you can't just gauge it by feeling. We even, alongside some colleagues here at the University of Brasilia, we tried to associate genotype with common symptoms as reported by a questionnaire. So we tried to associate the two. We had about 100, if not more, maybe 150 respondents whose genotype we knew, but there were no specific associations with these side effects or feelings, which is a shame, of course, because then that does mean that the only way to do that would be to get genetically tested. So that's, providing a blood sample or a saliva sample to a company, or, if you have access to a research lab, who could then potentially determine what your genotype is for this enzyme. So yeah, that's the only real way to do it.
Interesting. Okay. And then when someone is using caffeine during sport, you mentioned some potential side effects, obviously, if they're going too high, but is there a difference in how, well, I guess essentially, is there a difference in how their body's utilizing different substrates as fuel sources when they're utilizing caffeine? Are they less glycogen or more glycogen dependent?
Well, there is some evidence to suggest that caffeine can increase, say, fat oxidation during exercise. But what I would maybe caveat with that is potentially when you're working at the same intensity. So, most studies who have shown increased fat oxidation during exercise with caffeine, they've kind of fixed the exercise intensity. So one day they've looked at it with placebo, and the other day they've looked at it with caffeine, and they see that they had greater fat oxidation, which kind of the theory is, or at least was potentially, then you're saving muscle glycogen, which could then maybe be used later on in exercise. You kind of have more later on in exercise for maybe that kind of last intense spurt. But when you look at, say, non-fixed exercise, so like a time trial where you're trying to complete something as quick as possible, or you're going to exhaustion, something like that, what caffeine does, or it can allow you to do, is can allow you to work at a greater intensity. You can do more work again for that kind of same perception of effort.
Right.
But we know that at these higher intensities, what is important, simply because of the speed at which you need it, is that glycolysis is more important. So actually using those glycogen stores will likely increase with caffeine during these periods. So I think potentially you might be using more, but because you're doing more work.
Right.
So I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because you're tapping into the stores, and most of your endurance athletes are probably already topping themselves up quite well with exogenous carbohydrates. So I see no real issue to that. It kind of almost allows you, take that you've got caffeine gels that come within the carbohydrate gels, don't they? I think that's a pretty good way to make use of both.
Yeah, certainly. And you mentioned some side effects if people are consuming too much caffeine. What would those side effects be that people should keep an eye out for?
Obviously people can get a bit jittery, can get a bit overexcited, can get a bit, essentially, I was reading the other day that essentially kind of the adenosine complex in the brain, in the central nervous system, is actually there to avoid kind of overexcitation, over arousal. And obviously, if you're providing too much caffeine to an individual, this can have the opposite effects, and they can get over jittery, a bit restless, and can even have a lot of symptoms that are similar to those associated with anxiety. And obviously, these are symptoms and side effects that you don't really want to be having when you're at the start line and want to be sort of in a cool, calm state of Zen or whatever you need to be to begin your race.
Right.
But again, it kind of depends upon the individual. There are people who can easily take sort of these higher doses, and there's people who will already feel these side effects at the lower doses. So it really depends on you and how you can handle these potential side effects.
Yeah. Do we know if caffeine affects hydration status in the sense of like sweating more or less?
Good question. Thinking about sweating. Off the top of my head, I have a vague thought that there is potentially some data to suggest slightly increased sweating, but then sometimes it's is that just because the person was exerting themselves more forcibly during the exercise? And again, how relevant is that for exercise performance? Again, they've done more work, so that might have benefited. One of my friends and colleagues, Lewis James, he always who's an expert in the area of hydration. He always shows some slides of individuals who have kind of finished the marathon and won the marathon, and they've got an 8-9% reduction in body weight, and people are saying, oh, a 2% reduction worsens performance. It's like, of course it potentially can, but sometimes how relevant is it to that individual, to that moment? And so I don't think it's necessarily something to worry about. And in general, that kind of caffeine consumption and hydration status, I think it's one of those things that it's sort of an example of there being a potential real physiological reason for thinking that it might affect hydration status, because again, there's adenosine receptors in the kidneys that can affect kind of that reabsorption of water and of sodium. And in individual little studies, that's not to kind of dismiss them, but sort of they have shown slightly increased, say, water excretion during a short period. So there's one study who looked at water consumption only, or coffee containing 3 or 6 milligrams per kilo of body mass of caffeine. So again, kind of the lower dose and the higher dose of those kind of recommendations, and looking at water excretion over the following, is it 2 to 3 hours, something like that. And so compared to just water, the 3 milligram per kilogram dose of caffeine didn't change water excretion. The 6 milligrams, so the higher dose, did a slightly increase. I think it was about a 600 milliliter versus a 300 milliliter excretion of water over a 3-hour period, which, okay, the study showed a significant effect. And again, there's a physiological rationale. But then you've got to think, how does this translate across into what people are doing in real life on their day-to-day? Because a lot of people will be drinking their caffeine in coffee. And now all of a sudden, you're not just taking caffeine in, you're also taking 200, 300 milliliters of water, of fluid in. And there's a couple of nice studies from about 10 and 20 years ago that had people sort of over the course of, I think, 3 and 11 days, the 2 studies, had people ingest within coffee kind of 3 to 6 milligrams per kilo of caffeine each day, or decaffeinated coffee, obviously, as a control. And they didn't show differences in hydration status between these groups, and they kind of measured fluid excretion, urine color, urine osmolality, all these kinds of markers of hydration status, and didn't show differences. So I think, can it influence hydration status? Yes, but probably in the doses and the way that we're ingesting, it's probably not a cause for concern. And if you are a bit concerned, drink a little bit more water and an electrolyte solution. It's probably not such a big difference that all of a sudden you're going to be 6% dehydrated because you've ingested a caffeine capsule, you know.
Right. Yeah, yeah. The other question that I have that I get from a lot of clients that I would love for you to answer is the leading up to a race, cutting out caffeine completely for 1 to 2 weeks and then using it on race morning. Is there a benefit to that?
Yeah. This is the one that's probably a bit, I guess the word's not controversial, but maybe a bit more hotly debated, and the literature's a bit one way and two ways about it, really. So in my opinion, based upon the available data, I don't think it's necessary. Right now, at least, that we don't have solid evidence to suggest that you need to stop taking caffeine for a few weeks before a race. So there's some nice studies that have come out of Australia, mainly kind of Ben Desbrow's group, that have shown that kind of no withdrawal, you know, up to 1 or 2, up to 4 days of withdrawal of caffeine doesn't influence how effective that pre-exercise dose of caffeine is. So people taking, you know, caffeine up to the day before still benefited from caffeine the day just as much as those individuals who had stopped taking caffeine for kind of the 3 to 4 days before. So that it kind of, in my mind, suggests that habitual consumption isn't as important as we think it is. Now, again, that might be a little bit controversial because it's become a bit of a hot topic over the last few years. Like we published a study about 7 years ago now, where we measured via questionnaire the habitual consumption of our participants. So, you know, they let us know on average how much, you know, coffee, tea, energy drinks, etc. they were drinking, and we calculated approximately how much caffeine they were taking. And we obviously had them perform exercise with and without caffeine. And it didn't matter if they were, say, on the lower end of the scale, in the intermediate end of the scale, or the higher end of the scale of caffeine consumption. Caffeine seemed to be equally beneficial to these participants. And that's kind of been shown in a couple of our studies since. But there have been some other studies with different methodologies that have kind of shown that maybe habituation, so that habitual consumption, does influence performance. So one study took low consumers, so people who didn't drink maybe even as much as 1 cup of coffee per day, had them perform exercise tests with and without caffeine, showed caffeine improved performance, and then separated the groups and had one group take placebo every day for 4 weeks, and the other one take caffeine every day for 4 weeks. And then they came back to the lab to be tested again. And so now one of the groups has come back, and now they're habitual users. And so that did seem to reduce the effect of caffeine. It didn't eliminate it, but the beneficial effect was slightly reduced.
Yeah.
And that's been shown in another study as well. So again, that's something we're looking at here. We've got some ongoing studies. We're hoping to have some data, because there's always limitations to each study. There's limitations to our studies as well to exactly quantify how much caffeine people are taking. It's difficult, you know, and it varies from day to day. But based upon those data, and even another meta-analysis of ours in which we looked at how much habitual caffeine intake modified the caffeine response, and it didn't really. I would say right now, I don't think there's strong evidence to suggest you need it. If you're more than happy to take caffeine, coffee, tea, energy drinks out of your daily diet for 1 to 2 weeks prior to a competition, to maybe go for it. But it's one of those things, maybe the person won't enjoy that. So why take that pleasure away from the individual if it might have a minimal effect, if any? So my suggestion would be just keep going with it, and you'll probably still get that benefit from caffeine anyway, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's helpful because yeah, a lot of people will be miserable in those, like if they do like a 1 to 2 week
Yeah,
and they're getting headaches and yeah. So that's good to know. I want to be mindful of your time here and try and knock out a couple of our listener
sure,
questions.
no
So
worries.
we covered the kind of like, is the caffeine a diuretic? I think we covered the best time to caffeinate before and during a race. And then there was this one, it says, should you wait a few hours post waking before consuming caffeine to avoid the afternoon energy slump?
Um, yeah, I think that one there was a nice review that came out that kind of tried to deal with this one recently from the ISSN.
Mm.
Um, because that essentially they're kind of poking the bear at some maybe famous individuals who have kind of suggested this online, and it seems to have um, taken hold of people that they think that this is required.
Mm.
I don't think that there is any evidence. I don't think there's even any study. I might be wrong. Obviously, it's difficult to know every study that's out there, but I don't think there is actually a study that specifically ever looked at this, that tried
Mm.
to look at, okay, when people wake, we should maybe hold off because, what's the physiological rationale?
Mm.
Because your cortisol levels are supposedly sort of just taking off, and if you're giving caffeine, then you're interfering with these cortisol increases, and you're artificially increasing them, and then
Hmm.
later on during the day you can cause a crash because the caffeine is washing out. And there's not, as far as I'm aware, any study, any data that's actually looked at this.
Mhm.
Um, and so what I've also had with a lot of speaking to a lot of people is that, what is the evidence that caffeine causes any afternoon crash as well? I don't think there is. Number one, if you're worried, why don't you just have another coffee after in the afternoon?
Yeah.
If you're really worried about that, okay, that could potentially have some influence on sleep or not. But I think a lot of that potential afternoon crash is due to other confounding factors, due to your food consumption at that time. But I don't think it's really due to caffeine. So that's one that is probably definitely in the myth pile, that you really need to consume it within 1 to 2 hours. Again, if that's what
Mhm.
you want, if that's what you feel you get more of a benefit from it, be my guest. But I'm one of those people who don't think that you actually need to hold off at all. No.
Okay. I think that's helpful. I apologize if you hear my cat sneezing over here. Okay. So the next one we have here is sounds like maybe from a runner. How do you avoid having the urgency to go to the bathroom if you're consuming caffeine during a race?
Well, I guess that's suggesting that caffeine increases this urge. I think
Mhm.
there's uh I'm still, having had a read about it previously, I'm still unsure about how much it does influence
Mm, mhm.
the need to go to the bathroom. I think a lot of people say in the morning after they've had their coffee, they might sort of get the increased urge to then go and defecate.
Mhm.
But I think there's potentially more suggestion that this might be due to other compounds in the coffee rather due to the caffeine itself. So if
Oh,
you're taking
interesting.
if you're taking caffeine, say, as a supplement
Mm.
in a caffeine tablet, then you might not get that urge.
Hmm.
Um, if if let's say it is the case that caffeine causes this, well, then you've got no real way round avoiding it, in my opinion, other than trying to, evacuate as much as possible prior to your race. But yeah, there's nothing you could really do other
Yeah.
than not taking in caffeine or not taking too much caffeine. You can always try a reduced dose. Again, those guidelines are there as a guideline, 3 to 6, because we know it works. But if you want to try a little bit lower, try a little bit lower if that works for you, and you feel it improves your performance, or you're actually measuring that it improves your performance, and you no longer have that urge to defecate, then go with that. Stick with that.
Yeah. And then I'd add just checking in on fiber the day before too, minimizing that significantly. Okay, I'll ask you one last question because I know we're already over time here. Are you seeing any differences in how men versus women metabolize caffeine?
In terms of actual metabolism, that's a good question. So I need to get this right. So I believe at certain phases of the menstrual cycle, I think when estrogen is high, which almost counters the next point. So that says, forgive me, I should have checked this, because
No worries.
Because it does seem like then women who are on oral contraceptives, that also changes compared to say menstruating women. I believe it increases there's an induction in the actual metabolism, so it increases caffeine metabolism. Now I might be wrong on that, so there do potentially seem to be differences, but also within, so whether or not you're an oral contraceptive user or not, that could influence moments of the menstrual cycle phase. But again, it's one of those, how much does that actually reflect an important change or a change, physiological change that will influence performance?
Right.
Because there are some, probably not enough, and I know that work is being done, but there are some studies on female athletes looking at different phases of the menstrual cycle. Is caffeine, say, equally effective across them? And based upon that, sort of during the luteal, during the follicular, during the ovulatory phase, it seems equally effective. Based upon these few 2 to 3, potentially a couple more studies. So again, it's, maybe metabolism over 6-7 hours might be different, but during that initial 1 to 2 hour period, it probably doesn't necessarily reflect any big changes on exercise performance. So in general, the data do suggest that men and women are equally likely, for the most part, to benefit from caffeine supplementation.
Awesome. All right. That is, it's an interesting area for sure. Okay. So I'll go back to your 2 truths and a lie, so we can get some answers to those, because I'm curious about these. So I have, you're British, but lived more of your life in Brazil than Britain. You are a cyclist and own 8 different bikes, and that your primary research is on caffeine, but you don't drink caffeine. And I said, did I say the first one was a lie? I think, yeah, because I feel like the other ones could be true. And Amanda, you said the bike one was a lie?
I said the bike one, but I'm wondering now.
Yeah. Tell it, which one was the lie, Bryan?
I almost tripped myself up before, because I almost said, like, when I have my morning coffee.
You almost revealed it.
I totally started thinking, we started talking about that, and we were like, just have a second cup. And I'm like, that's a coffee drink.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you do, that's their lie. So you do drink caffeine.
Yes. I'm British. I love my tea. I live in Brazil. They have fantastic coffee, so I love coffee. I'm not a big fan of energy drinks, so I don't really drink energy drinks. But the coffee one, the caffeine one, was the lie. And yeah, I've lived in Brazil for 12 years now. I only lived in the UK for 8 years, because I was actually born and raised in Belgium.
Wow.
So,
oh, wow. Okay.
But I have British nationality. It's always difficult to explain to people. I'm born and raised in Belgium, but I'm not Belgian. I'm British.
Yeah.
So.
Wow. And you are a big cyclist, it sounds like, too. So
Yes, I love cycling. I'm
Awesome.
not sort of like a competitive cyclist, but I
Mhm.
love cycling. I've got a few bikes here. I've still got a few bikes back home in Belgium. So
Awesome.
um I think the correct number of bikes to have is N+1, where N is the number of bikes you currently have. So
Awesome. I love it. Do you do primarily road or you do all gravel, mountain, all the things?
uh primarily road,
Mhm.
but now that I have a son who's 2 years old, it's
Oh.
you can't get a seat to put on the front of a road bike. So
Oh
I've
yeah.
been mainly kind of mountain bike. So we kind of go
Yeah.
off road and dirt, and
Fun.
he loves it. Yeah.
That's great. That's awesome. Well, this has been so fascinating. And I know we actually didn't even get to all our listener questions, but this has been such a helpful podcast, I'm sure, for our listeners and myself. I always love it when I get to learn new stuff too on the podcast. So thank you again so much for joining us. And where can people
Thank you.
find you, follow you, all that good stuff?
So I do a bit of tweeting on
Mm.
Twitter. My hashtag is, oh, it's called X now, isn't it? I still call it Twitter. Um, at bicycle_Bryan, and
Okay.
that's Brian with a Y. And ResearchGate is a good place to say for those people who actually want to maybe follow up and comfortable reading a scientific article.
Mhm.
So on there you can generally find most things downloadable for free, and if not, you sort of just click on a button and I can send it through to you. So that's probably
Awesome.
the two best ways to find me.
Great. Well, we will link the Twitter handle in the show notes, and then any of the articles we talked about today, we will link in the show notes as well, and the ResearchGate link as well. And again, thank you so much for your time, Bryan. This has been so fun.
No, thank you. Thank you very much.